Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the sponsor yield?
Mr. Zabrowski, will you yield?
I'll yield, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Zabrowski yields, sir.
The last time I debated a bill on this topic, it was Assemblyman Ortiz. His name was on the piece of legislation. I appreciate you being here today. I was just wondering why your name isn't up as a sponsor today.
Because the Speaker sponsored this bill.
Okay, thank you. Do we anticipate that the governor is going to sign this bill into law?
I have no idea. I heard the same comments you did, Mr. Walczyk. I have no idea whether he's going to sign the bill or not.
Okay, so if the governor doesn't sign this bill, we would have the opportunity then, being a check on the executive, in both houses of the legislature, we would have to pass this with a 2/3 majority in order to override his veto. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. When are his extraordinary powers, when are his extraordinary powers set to expire right now as things lie before this bill?
The current expiration in Section 4 is April 30th, 2021.
And this piece of legislation that you're bringing forward, or well, you're debating on behalf of the Speaker, who is the sponsor of this legislation, what's the expiration date that's in this legislation?
As I said earlier, Mr. Walczyk, it's tough to put a specific expiration because there are multiple expiration dates. The expiration date of the ability to issue new directives is immediate. The expiration date for current directives is 30 days. There's a process, a review process set up by which they could be presented to be extended with legislative comment. But of course, 30 days isn't even really accurate because the legislature could expire anything at any time.
I'm glad you brought up directives, and I appreciate that because it leads into my next question. When it comes to modifications of directives, as you've laid out in this, as the Speaker has laid out in this piece of legislation, which you are debating here today, what are the left and right limits in this legislation to say this modification really isn't in keeping with the idea of this executive order? It's gone too far. Are there left and right limits written into this legislation, or is the executive have the ability to pretty much issue anything as a modification within an existing executive order?
You can find that language on page 3, subsection D, lines 17 through 26.
So, Executive Order 20296, if that stays in place, will this allow the governor to, for example, stonewall an investigation that the Attorney General is launching into his current administration?
No, I don't believe so. What's the question?
Under Executive Order 20296, if that executive order stays in place, which this doesn't propose.
I don't have all my executive orders in front of me. Could you read me 20296?
Well, this is an executive order that would allow him to block the Attorney General because he's in a state of an emergency. Block the Attorney General or not respond to the Attorney General because of this state of emergency that he's declared. And because the Attorney General is launching an investigation into his office, which you may be aware of, I'm concerned that this legislation doesn't go far enough in saying that this particular executive order should not stand.
Mr. Walczyk, I do not know of any executive order. I'm also not sure, is this 20296 a directive or is it pursuant to historical powers? I don't know of any executive order that would give him the ability to subvert the Attorney General in any investigation. Well, you're welcome to speak on the bill and describe the executive order and all the things you think, but, just sort of throwing that at me, I do not believe so. Yeah. You could read me 20296.
No,
we can discuss it on the floor, and I can try to interpret it for you.
I'll move on because in 15 minutes there's a lot of points that I would like to make, and I think we'll probably find out if he's stonewalling the Attorney General by abuse of his executive overreach. I wouldn't want to continue to enable that behavior, but I'll move along.
I wouldn't either, Mr. Walczyk. So if you think there's an executive order and we can't discuss it here, call me after and we'll work on it together.
I appreciate that. And like you just described, I think the overwhelming number of executive orders, as well as the breadth of all of these executive orders, make it very difficult to keep in touch with each one of them when we don't deliberate in chambers like the Assembly or across the building in the Senate and have these open dialogues about how our government should run. It can be very confusing. So I hear your point. Will this bill stop the governor from withholding funds to school districts and local governments?
So, Mr. Walczyk, I've thought of this, and I've thought of that executive order in particular, and I would say within the parameters of this bill, it would no longer be effective because um, it would not comply with the language I read earlier in that it has nothing to do with the spread and/or reduction of COVID-19. It's not an imminent threat to public health and safety. That being said, there's budgetary language, as you know, so I'd have to sort of confer with the chair of Ways and Means, combine those two. But within the four corners of this bill, that would not meet that criteria. I'd need to speak to the chair of Ways and Means to get an analysis of how it interplays with that budgetary language.
I think I appreciate your response. I think I can understand what you're trying to say here. The changing of the budget was something that was extended within the budget. If you voted for the budget last year, you were voting to give the governor some extraordinary ability throughout this year to also deal with the fiscal crisis that goes along as a third order of effect of our governmental reaction to the COVID crisis. So that budget coming up in a few weeks, does this piece of legislation, which is supposed to, well, it says termination of executive powers by the legislature, does this do anything to address, if we vote on a budget in 3 weeks from now, does the governor have the ability to change that budget in perpetuity anytime he feels, as long as this emergency pandemic continues?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay.
As you mentioned, there's budgetary language that was passed last year that gives certain authority, and some of that authority is supposed to, if they're going to exercise it, they're going to make certain cuts. There were supposed to be sent back to the legislature. Some of those things have sort of been withholding. And then if it's a withhold, it has to be a notification to the legislature. So there's a whole budgetary process that probably should be a question for Chair Weinstein. But you asked me if within the context of this bill, does it give the governor power to do anything budgetarily going forward? I don't believe so.
Well, yeah, as you understand, the governor has delayed payment to certain nonprofits. He's stopped payment to school districts, to municipalities on grant programs, various funding streams that we've gone through the arduous budget process here in this chamber to allocate those funds. He's stopped those payments. My concern is that we're negotiating a budget, or maybe not even. We're probably just behind the scenes preparing our rubber stamps for the governor's budget once again, and that we won't even have a say in the process, and it won't matter what budget he presents to the public, because he'll retain the authority to change that budget whenever he pleases.
Mr. Walczyk, you are really going far out of bounds of this bill.
Yeah.
But can you let me answer? I mean, you asked the question. I would just say the rubber stamp thing is, I think, out of bounds. We'll vote on a one-house budget resolution soon, and not to step on that process, but it won't be a rubber stamp. But within the context of this bill, I don't know what you're talking about. If you could answer me, ask the question of how this bill relates to the budget. My short answer is it does not. But if you want to have a further debate on it, you have to explain to me how you think it does.
No, that's fair. I appreciate it. The short question was, does this address that? And it's clear that it doesn't. Will this bill prevent the governor from using contact tracers to harass or reach out to citizens that are otherwise law-abiding?
So your question presupposes that contact tracers are harassing people. I'm not sure that I've gotten that in my district. Perhaps you have in yours. I don't believe the contact tracing is within a directive executive order. It could be, but I guess that goes back to my point earlier. We need an orderly process to review all these things and see what's necessary and not necessary and what needs to be changed.
Agreed, but there's nothing specifically in this legislation that would prevent that type of behavior.
I laid out the construct of this legislation. So I would say if you think that behavior is happening and you think it's within a directive that is somehow going to survive, and I don't believe it is, but once again, I think that's why we need a review process of all these directives, then I would say there's a review process and an ability for us to cancel that out.
Thank you.
But once again, you're assuming something that I don't know that I assume about contact tracing.
That's fair. Mr. Speaker, I have a number of other questions, but if the sponsor would yield for one last sort of big picture question here.
Mr. Zabrowski, will you yield for one last big picture question?
I will yield for one last big picture
The
question.
sponsor yields, Mr. Walczyk.
A leader in New York State this summer said people need to believe in government. Would you agree?
I don't have any quotes in front of me, Mr. Walczyk, so tell me who said it, and I will take your word for it.
Governor Andrew Cuomo, in a book that he wrote this summer, said people need to believe in government on page 21.
I did not read the book.
Well, would you agree with the sentiment?
People need to believe in government? Sure.
Okay. Thank you very much on behalf of the Speaker for debating this legislation. Mr. Speaker, on the bill.
On the bill, Mr. Walczyk.
The same individual that was writing a book during this pandemic, during this emergency pandemic that continues to have those emergency powers, while writing a book, also said people will make the right judgment if they know the facts. The man who was lying about the facts at the same time was writing a book telling New Yorkers this is the way that you handle an American crisis. And on page 28 says people will make the right judgment if they know the facts. I agree with the statement, not the man. On 52, I've got the Cliff Notes in front of me. On page 52, he said what matters most is your legacy and your integrity. Wow. I agree with the man's assessment of himself. I can see the way that he conducts his business in that office. He certainly believes that the most important thing is his legacy. I think another lie, in addition to the facts that he was lying to the public and lying to this body about, was that integrity is also important to him. On page 69, he said, for me, the lasting feeling was fear. This is a leader. This is the leader of New York State in the middle of an emergency pandemic, retaining emergency powers, writing a book about it, and telling us that he is gripped by fear. On page 87, he says non-essential workers, they're lucky that they don't have to go to work. Have you guys answered the phone in your office lately? What non-essential worker has called you up and said, thank goodness I don't have a job right now? This guy is so far out of touch. Here's the rest of the questions as my time quickly expires. Does this bill that we're voting on right now prevent the governor from fining New Yorkers $10,000 for not filling out the proper traveling forms? No. Does this bill prevent the governor from deciding whose jobs are essential and whose are non-essential? Nope, sure doesn't. Does it prevent him from doing pop-ups in New York State for his favorite artists while telling your local restaurant that they can't have live music? Sure doesn't. Does it stop him from suspending competition bidding at the MTA and anti-corruption laws that oversee the MTA? No, it sure doesn't. What about stopping kids from playing sports? It doesn't do that. What about stopping the governor from telling people how many visitors they can have in their home? Nope. Telling pastors how many parishioners they can have in their church? Nope, not in this bill. Implementing a moratorium on rent? No, he can still do that. It's not addressed here. Does it Does this bill prevent the governor from telling Western New Yorkers that chicken wings aren't a substantial meal? No, he can modify an order. He can do it tomorrow. Chicken wings aren't a substantial meal again. Sure, maybe he becomes a Jets fan tomorrow. I don't know. Does it stop him from defunding state police or police departments that don't comply with reimagining themselves? Sure doesn't. An executive order that came during this pandemic. I appreciate it, and I thank you for the slight extension. Mr. Speaker, I would conclude by saying this body needs to stop playing pretend. There are very real issues before New Yorkers, and if the headline reads tomorrow that you reined in the governor, your constituents are going to expect something from you. And what they expect you to do is to vote no on this and actually be a check on the executive. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.